If you could ask God one question, what would be that one question? Randy Newman, who was a campus pastor for over 20 years, has had this opportunity to ask this very question to students. And he has gotten all kinds of responses. Some of them are pretty funny. One person said, "Why didn't the Packers win the Super Bowl this year?" Easy answer, but beside the point. "Why did you make men so dumb? Why are women so hard to figure out?" And while those responses are quite comical and funny, there are some more serious ones. For many people, the number one question that they would ask God centers around evil and suffering. And maybe that's a question that you would ask, that you are wrestling with. I can remember it like yesterday. It was my first year as being a youth pastor. No matter of fact, it was my first 2 months of being in ministry, period. And I had taken a group of about 20 students and a handful of leaders of 20 high school students, a handful of leaders, to a conference in Los Angeles. Day number 2, we're in the lunchroom, and my phone rings. It's one of our students who wasn't able to make it on the trip, and she is just crying profusely on the phone. I'm 24, 25 years old with no country knowledge and no farming experience whatsoever. The most farming experience I have had with farm animals is what ends up on my dinner plate, okay? It's not very much. The student she's very big into programs like FFA and other things like that. And it's important you know that about this story, because this is what it kind of centers around. And so anyways, I'm doing the most pastoral thing that I think to do, and I just ask questions and I listen. I said, "What's going on?" And I paused just long enough to hear what she was saying through each gasp. She said, "My kid died," followed with more tears. And my heart just plummeted to the ground. I was not prepared for a tragedy of this magnitude. I mean, her kid died. How do you console a grieving mother on the phone over something like this? I didn't even know she had a kid. I mean, what kind of youth pastor am I to not know a detail like this about my student? And I stumbled my way through the phone call. And I walked over to our leader sitting at the table, shoulders slumped. Clearly, I am visibly shaken to my core over this. And I said, "Guys, I have some bad news." I said, so-and-so, yeah. She called and she told me her kid died. One of our leaders who actually knows this student fairly well and is more experienced with country and farming stuff had a good laugh as they told me, "Skylar, kid as in baby goat, not as in baby human baby." And have you ever had one of those moments where you just feel like this great relief come over you? Your knees get weak and you just want to scream at the top of your lungs. Like, that is this moment for me. And that moment, it was probably a moment that I will never experience so much joy, relief, and celebration over something's death before, right? It probably won't ever happen like that again. But that moment for me has branded into my mind and my heart. Not just that I need to kind of be a little bit more cultured, but also the heaviness of the question that the problem of evil and suffering brings to many people's lives. I mean, in the short phone call that I had all kinds of questions, all kinds of tears and concerns just wash over me. God, how could you let something like this happen? God, what do you even say in a tragedy like this? God, is there any good that can come out of this? I mean, the question takes on different levels of pain and meaning the older we get. So what do we say? I mean, what question do we ask? For many people, the challenge this question poses is one that challenges the very existence and goodness of God. For many people, the idea of asking God any kind of question seems pointless, since there seems not to be a God who responds to tragedy, with all the wrong in the world. And so some may say to me, "What question would I ask?" None, because there's no God to ask him. And if there is a God, he's not worth asking it to. So is that true? Does the problem of evil and suffering challenge the existence of God or the goodness of God? The problem of evil and suffering has been kind of called the Achilles heel to the Christian faith. Its mere presence of suffering on earth presents this perceived lethal blow to the idea that God exists. And this is one of the oldest questions that people have asked. It's as old as time. In fact, the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, who lived a few hundred years predating Christ, he said it like this: is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's not omnipotent, all-powerful. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both willing and able? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? The heart of Epicurus, the Epicurean argument, is if God is all-powerful, he should be able to create a perfect world without suffering. And if he has my good in mind, then why do I suffer so greatly in this life? Because the world isn't perfect and I suffer. He is either not there or he's not good. So again, I ask, does this mean that God doesn't exist or that God is not good? Well, before we answer that question, let me kind of frame up this problem with a few observations. First, it's a personal problem. Yeah, you can watch the news, see corruption in the government, drug trafficking, harm that's being done to kids across the globe. But there comes a point when this issue hits you in the opening of your armor and it hurts beyond what words can express. Being a pastor in the church, this is an ever-present issue I'm faced with almost daily and weekly. I mean, it can be quite overwhelming. I mean, you hear of people's paralyzing fears, of cancer scares, sudden losses, family-damaging affairs, just to name a few things. And when the pain hits you, when it comes home to you, it hits you in a way that no news anchor can fully express the depth of pain. This issue is not just an intellectual problem, it is a deeply personal problem. But this isn't anything unfamiliar to the Bible. In fact, it's a biblical problem. This problem is at the very center of the Bible. You don't even get 3 chapters into this book before we are introduced to the origin of the problem, right? Adam and Eve, they disobeyed God and they sent into motion this deadly toxin that has led to the undoing of us all, including creation. And the Bible begins by cueing us in that this is a problem that this very book that we call the Bible is concerning itself with. And it is something that this God in the Bible is seeking to address. This problem is not just a problem at the beginning, it is also echoed all throughout the Bible. For example, King David wrote this song, and when I read this, hear it to the tune of country music, okay? But Psalm chapter 6, my soul is in deep anguish. How long, Lord, how long? Turn, Lord, and deliver me. Save me because of your unfailing love. Among the dead, no one proclaims your name. Who praises you from the grave? I am worn out from my groaning. All night long I flood my bed with weeping and drench my couch with tears. But this is not just a question posed here on earth. The Apostle John tells us that people in heaven, of all places, are asking this very question. Revelation chapter 6. When he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony that they had maintained. They called out in a loud voice, how long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood. The Bible does not ignore, it doesn't run from, it doesn't explain away the problem of evil and suffering. No, the Bible acknowledges that this is a problem and it is seeking to address this problem. But this is not just a personal problem, nor is it just a biblical problem. It is also everyone's problem. It's not just an issue that Christians must wrestle with. It's an issue every single one of us must wrestle with. Every single religion and worldview must address. So how do you answer this? What answers do you give to the problem of evil and suffering? To me, the Christian answer is the most robust and beautiful answer that can be offered. But when it comes down to it, any worldview, any religion has to give an account to it. And a one that cannot answer this problem in a way that is satisfactory, that it doesn't deny evil and suffering or minimizes it, is not worth following. So what are the options that are presented? One commonly held view is a New Age spirituality. It is a kind of melting pot of Eastern religious thought. One basic characteristic of it is that there is this unity all throughout creation. Everything is connected. And everything is part of the divine. Everything is, in a sense, God, right? This is what's called pantheism, that all is God. So according to this view, humans have this divineness inside of them. So simply through meditation and praying and positive thinking and journeying inward, we can get in touch with divine and become enlightened, spiritually awakened people, right? This is the goal. And since everything is in this view divine, nothing technically speaking can be classified as evil. It's divine. I mean, evil is just this illusion of what is. Like, the reality of evil is just flat out denied. Mark Clark, who I get to share my interview this week, in his book, The Problem of God, he tells this story about visiting this elderly woman whose husband was dying from cancer in a hospital, and she told him that her best friend wouldn't go with her to the hospital to visit her dying husband. And when Mark asked why, this is what her response was. Her best friend believed if she went to the hospital, she would be acknowledging the reality that the man was sick, and in doing so would give this false sickness power over him. Her best friend believed if she went to the hospital, she would be acknowledging the reality that the man was sick, and in doing so would give this false sickness power over him. Look, if I'm being honest, I don't feel like that kind of view is very in touch with reality. I mean, it doesn't take much investigation, it doesn't take much convincing to see and be bothered by the evil that is clearly in the world. The Bible says evil is real, and it is so bad that it cannot be ignored, explained away, or denied. It must be dealt with. And so God dealt with it by sending Jesus to earth. Another view that deals with the problem of evil is Hinduism's karma. I'm sure you heard of this concept. The phrase that gets popularly thrown around is, what goes around comes around. I mean, the basic idea of karma is that you get paid in the next life according to the good and bad you've done in this life. And the same is true with your life right now, right? That what you are experiencing, the good and the bad, is a result from what you've done in the previous life. And so if you're suffering bad fortune now, well, it's because you deserved it. And if you step outside of the American soil and popular spirituality, and you go somewhere that has truly embraced this at a national and cultural level, it's actually kind of troubling. Mark Clark, again in his book, he recounts a time when he was visiting India, and as he was visiting, he was traveling through some slum-like conditions where people are literally lining the streets, just dying of starvation, not being able to eat food. And he recounts one moment where this woman came and she was just scratching at the van window, holding this somewhat, this baby that was just hanging on for dear life. And the tour guide turned and told Mark, "You can't give her any money. If you stop karma from doing its job to this woman and her baby, she'll have to live this suffering again in the next life." Karma says people are serving their sentences and their rewards now. And it is wrong for anybody to interject themselves into that system, into that situation, and try to alleviate somebody's suffering. And this is just my opinion, but I don't think this adequately answers the question about suffering. It appears to feed this sort of vicious cycle of poverty and violence and abuse. To me, this doesn't take the problem of suffering and evil serious enough. There's a story in the Bible where Jesus and his disciples, they come across this man who had been born blind. And so the disciples, apparently they're buying into some kind of idea like this. And they ask Jesus this. In John chapter 9, his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned? This man or his parents that he was born blind? Clearly, somebody is at fault. I mean, he is serving his sentence. Jesus, whose fault is it? Jesus' answer, neither. It was so that God's power could be displayed in this man. And so when people wonder, man, is God punishing me right now? Is God just causing all of these bad things to happen because of something I did? Or is somehow my previous life haunting me today? Because it just seems like I go from bad to worse, like one bad thing after the other just keeps hitting me. The Bible's answer is a resounding no. Bad things don't happen to you for any other reason other than we live in a very broken, fallen world. And you have every right to dislike that. You have every right to be angry with the evil and the suffering in this world and to want to change that, to want to improve the world, alleviate the suffering. I mean, you're not serving your sentence of suffering in this life, right? There is hope now. Like, there's hope now. Another view that is commonly held is with the problem of evil is with atheism. And the gist of atheism, the gist of this view, says that because there's evil and suffering, it is a proof that God does not exist. This view makes several wrong assumptions, if you will. It assumes that if God exists and he's all good, then he must remove all evil from the world. But because he hasn't, I mean, clearly, look outside, you can see the evil. He must not be there. But there's several problems with this view. First, why assume that that is the only appropriate response for God, right? Why assume that the only response that is okay for a all-powerful, all-wise, all-knowing God just to wipe out all evil? I mean, what if God has a different and a better plan in mind than that? Second, you've got to ask yourself this question. If God is going to remove all evil, to what extent is he going to remove all evil? I mean, what kind of evil does he take away? A murder, kidnapping, genocide? Clearly, that needs to go. But what about bullying? What about petty theft? What about gossip? What about the playground brawls? What about the selfishness that begins as a little kid, but then it morphs into something worse later on? Like, where do you draw the line? I mean, if God is going to be God and he's going to deal with evil completely, don't you think that he's going to completely deal with all evil? And if you're honest with yourself, we all have something inside of us that is crooked. We all have something inside of us that is broken. We have all of this, the seed of evil living in us, which would mean if God was going to take away all evil, it would mean him removing all humans. So is the fact that he hasn't done that evidence that he doesn't exist, or is it evidence that he is patiently doing something else? But here is an even greater issue in my mind with this view. This view assumes that there is such a thing as evil and there's such a thing as good. And that this evil challenges the existence of God. But the issue that this presents to atheism is, where in the world did we get this distinction between good and evil from? C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, he talked about this major pivot that he experienced going from atheism to Christianity. But he boils everything down to this. He said, where did we get this idea of something being evil from? In his words, he called it cruel in an unjust world. He says a man doesn't call a line crooked unless he knows what a straight line looks like. So where did we get the idea of good, of bad, of right, of wrong, of justice, of injustice? I mean, if the world is just what it is without some supreme God who gives us these innate moral guides, his moral compass, we should have never come to a point where we have made a distinction between right and wrong, between good and evil. We should have just accepted it as what it is. And yet every single human being, every single human culture, everyone has some basic idea of justice, of injustice, of right, of wrong. And every culture encourages not to violate whatever rule, whatever law that is. I mean, no doubt it looks different place to place, person to person, but the basic idea that there is some morals, there's some moral guide governing us across the globe, across history, begs the question, where in the world did that come from? I mean, natural science doesn't teach us how to love people. It doesn't teach us how to treat our kids. It doesn't treat us how to be fair to our neighbor. No, it shows us things like, how does gravity work? Where did we get the idea that it is wrong to steal, to murder innocent lives? Where do we get the idea that it is wrong to take another person from a family? Where did that idea come from? I mean, if we remove God from the equation, you have a very hard time making any kind of real distinction between something being absolutely good and absolutely evil, which can and does create a very cruel world. My point is simply to say that the very fact that we can call something evil and wrong and bad, it bears witness to the fact that there is some kind of ultimate good that we sense inside of us, and it begs the question, where did that come from? So the argument against God, it actually turns out to be an argument profoundly for God. As Mike said in the interview this past Wednesday, what about the problem of good? So, what do we say then? God might exist, but he's certainly not good for allowing all this evil and suffering to exist? I mean, there's no doubt that our suffering causes some of the greatest questions, some of the most challenging doubts to well up within us. But whatever you think of when you think of God, the picture that we have in the Bible of this God is totally different than what many people actually think of. In the ancient Greek world, one commonly held belief about, the quote-unquote, the pantheon of gods, the gods, was that they could not suffer. They could not experience the lowly human emotions, what is called divine impassibility. This was no small matter for a world that is saturated in Greek philosophy to suggest that there was a God who could experience the same human emotions as us and even suffer, was to suggest that he, or whatever it was less than divine. And yet, we have recounted in one of the biographies of Jesus a picture of not only this God relating to us at an emotional level of what we feel, but a God who related to us by becoming fully human without betraying his divinity. John said it like this in John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. The Greek word for word is logos, which for the Greeks stood for the reason, the rationality that governed and gave order to the universe. And for the Jews, it went all the way back to Genesis chapter 1. As the voice in the beginning spoke, God spoke, and he said, "Let there be light." And there's light. And John says that word was Jesus. Continuing, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. To Greeks and Jews, John writes, the one who created, the one who governs, the one who mediates God's presence to humans is God. And he came in human form in the person of Jesus, fully revealing God to us. I mean, this is radical. This is scandalous. God becoming man, impossible, right? Ludicrous. And yet this is the message of the Bible. God added to his divinity humanity. Why? John continues in verse 17. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. What is the purpose? To make God known to us. To those who thought of God in an abstract way, God becomes real. To those who saw God as unapproachable, God becomes approachable. And it was this God that when his kids ran away from home, he went on a search party for them. He is more radical than Liam Neeson in the movie Taken. And this is a God who leaves heaven for his kids. This is the heart of God. This is the message in the Bible. But here's the other thing. God came knowing what the cost of this trip was going to be, that it was going to be abandonment, being misunderstood, mistreated, and then eventually lynched to a tree. And knowing all of that, knowing what it was going to cost him to get his kids back, to rescue his kids, he did it anyway. And moments before his death, Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he is wrestling with the pain of what is to come. Not just the pain of nails, whips, and fists, but the pain of a perfect relationship being severed. I mean, the ultimate consequence of human sin is eternal exclusion from God. And when we choose sin, we are telling God, God, I don't want you. I don't want you in my life. And so God's punishment is not God giving us what we don't deserve. It is God giving us what we've asked for, what we have freely chosen, a world without him. And the pain of that is just agonizing. It is faintly like the pain of experiencing a spouse say to their other spouse of however many years, I never want to see you again. Or a child who considers their parent as good as dead to them. The pain of that is far worse, far deeper, and it hurts far more than any cut, any bruise, any broken bone can ever make you feel. And on the cross, Jesus took the fullness of human sin, the fullness of our separation, the full consequence upon himself, so that no person would have to ever experience that at an eternal level. And the pain of that experience for Jesus, I mean, it's eternally unbearable, and Jesus bore it all. And while we may not have an answer for why God hasn't removed all evil and suffering, we have a God who came to earth to identify with us by revealing a God who would suffer on our behalf, who would go to the cross for us. We have a God who relates to us at every single level. And so when we are in the depth of questioning and pain and we are suffering, we can ask, when we ask God, where are you? Where were you? Why didn't you stop this from happening? We have a God who wants us to know him, not as a God who's up there somewhere, far removed from us or unmoved from us, but as a God who wants to be known by the name Emmanuel, God with us. A God who suffers. So whatever you think of, when you think of God, think of the one hanging on the cross on our behalf. He is a God who can call out, he is a God that you can call out to, that you can relate to in the dark moments of betrayal and heartbreak. A God who can whisper hope in the screams of tyranny and corruption. In the Bible, we don't have a pie-in-the-sky vision of life. You know, one that says, just have faith and everything's going to work out. That's not what we believe. We have a faith that looks at the real, honest struggle of evil, injustice, and suffering. And in that kind of a world, we see people cry out in the Scripture, when, O God, will you bring justice? Why, O God, do you let the wicked prosper? How long, O Lord, must we suffer and agonize to the point of death? The biblical vision of the problem of evil and suffering is one of wrestling and questioning. And if that is not in touch with reality, I don't know what else is. I mean, any view that makes evil and suffering less than what it actually is, or it tries to kind of outright deny it or minimize it, does not take it serious enough. And the Bible says suffering and evil is real. It is pervasive. It is problematic. And we have real people in Scripture wrestling with God over this. And God's response is not, well, it's not my problem, so suck it up, buttercup, right? That's not God's response. God says, your sin, your suffering is so much for you to bear. I'm going to send my son so he could bear the full weight of it in your place. But the Bible doesn't just stop there. It doesn't just speak about a God who relates to us in our suffering, but a God who can transform suffering. The instrument that killed Jesus, the cross, it becomes the instrument that saves us. Jesus' suffering and death, it becomes the means of our salvation. Why? Because Jesus rose from the dead. Because of Jesus' suffering, death, and his resurrection from the grave, the message of the Bible is that our suffering is not wasted. That somehow in the end, it will be redeemed. It will get redeemed. Something far more beautiful than anything we could ever imagine will come. C.S. Lewis said this in The Great Divorce: "You cannot in your present state understand eternity. That is what mortals misunderstand. They say of some temporal suffering, no future bliss can make up for it, not knowing that heaven, once attained, will work backwards and turn even that agony into glory." Unless we think, C.S. Lewis is just being poetic and creative, what he says is the same thing that is what Paul says in Romans chapter 8. He says, "I consider that our present suffering are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us." The message of the Bible takes the problem of suffering far beyond anything that we could ever ask or imagine. And in many ways, it invites us to look into the future and see something now that appears fanciful here, but then it will be incomparably greater than anything and everything we have ever experienced. The message of the Bible says there is a God who loves you so much that he wanted to relate to you. He suffered for you, and one day he will fully redeem us. A God who will take our darkest moments in life and turn them into the greatest trophies in heaven. And if we could hold up our suffering in one hand and the masterful work that God will perform one day in the future, we would not even want to compare the two. The analogy comparable to this life to come, and what's to come of it all, is that of childbirth. I mean, while the pain seems unbearable now, it comes with a joy far greater than anything before it. And I don't know about you, but if you are not a Christian, this should be something that you want to be true. Because it is a message that says that if you accept Jesus' death on the cross for your sin and resurrection from the grave, all of your suffering, all of your painful, maybe pointless and agonizing moments that you experience here in this life, one day it will be redeemed. One day it will be repurposed. One day it will be remade into something so beautiful that you won't even want to compare the two. And I don't know about you, but there is something inside of me that screams that bad men should not keep getting away with their evil things. And in my life, suffering should not continue to happen. My life should not be filled with this pointless suffering of just toiling under the sun until one day I die. In me, I feel that life was meant for more than this, and that suffering is this rude interruption to my life. And it is the message of the Bible that says that the things that you most desperately dream to be true are true. It's not that you're out of touch with reality, it's that our reality has been messed up. It's not out there somewhere, nor is it inside of here, tucked away, waiting for us to kind of uncover it. No, it's found in the one who hung on the tree for me, who bore my sin to bring me redemption. And it is through him we get this glory. We get this picture. And here in this life, we may not get the prettiest, the richest, and the most blessed life that we want, but we are assured from him that we will have peace in the midst of the greatest storms of our life. Jesus said this in John 16, "I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." So while we may ask questions like, how could God exist with all the evil and suffering in my world? When we take into account everything that we've talked about, the question kind of gets turned around. How can we go on existing without a God who suffers and offers us the ultimate picture of hope, of healing, of meaning, and of redeeming all things, including the things that were the undoing of us all, including creation, that is suffering? The question that begs an answer is that, how can we continue to exist without this kind of a God in our life? And it's not up to anybody else to answer that question but you. How will you respond? How will you answer that question? He's here. He listens. He's waiting. Emmanuel, God with us. He is a God who has come for you, and he's waiting for you to respond. How will you respond? Hey, I want to say thank you so much for joining us online. Do me a favor, if this message today was encouraging or helpful in any way, I want to ask that you just take a couple of moments, like this video, and then share this video. Also, if you go to our website, thechristianchurchoflitchfield.com, you will find under the sermon a bunch of resources for you and your family. Under the sermon notes, there's some questions and reflection things for you as well. You can also, underneath the sermon, you will find a giving button just to keep giving to the church. We give in response to what God has given to us by giving His own Son. Giving is an act of worship. There's many ways to keep giving through maybe PayPal, mailing in a check, stopping by the office, or even setting up auto payment through your bank. This coming Wednesday, I am really excited to share with you my guest. My guest is Mark Clark. Every Wednesday at 10 a.m., I share an interview I have done with somebody. And this Wednesday, it is Mark Clark. Mark is a pastor of a church, a very large church in Vancouver, Canada, very gracious with his time with me. But he's also the author of a book called The Problem of God's soon coming book, The Problem of Jesus. And this Wednesday is my interview with him about the problem of Jesus. I mean, what makes Jesus so different? I mean, across the board, why is Jesus different? And why is he viewed different? Why do Christians claim that he is the only way to God? And how do you help skeptics truly believe and become Christians? If you missed this interview or you don't have Facebook, you can simply find it on iTunes, on the iTunes podcast. Just simply search Unpacked with Skylar and you can find it there. Or you can go to the church's website. You'll be able to find it there too. Church, we love you and we are praying for you. We'll see you this Wednesday. God bless.